So just so I kind of know who's here, I mean, how many of you guys have either worked with FedRAMP before or FISMA in general? Okay. So I've got this kind of set up to do more slides at the beginning and then go into more of a Q&A at the end. So, I mean, if you have any questions, I mean, feel free to ask and we can go from there. So, quick intro. Let's see if this works. Okay. Quick intro about us. My company is called Nightline Security. We do security consulting, risk assessments, vulnerability management, that kind of thing. We also do a number of compliance projects, PCI DSS, ISO, HIPAA, and FedRAMP, obviously. I myself have 7 years, sorry. I have about 7 or 8 years working in the federal space, doing a number of FISMA and DICAP projects. Over the last 2, maybe 3 years, I got into doing FedRAMP for a major cloud provider, and that's just kind of what I've been doing for the past few years prior to starting up my company. So if anyone ever wants to reach out, if you have any questions, I mean, feel free to get a hold of me. My website's up here. You can download the slides later. Also, you know, I'm always on Twitter. So starting at the beginning, what is FedRAMP? For those of you who don't have any experience with it, all federal agencies are required to comply with the Federal Information Security Management Act, which is FISMA. And that is a set of rules and regulations based on 853 Rev 3. They haven't really hit Rev 4 yet. So FedRAMP is very similar to that in nature. It's based on the same set of controls that FISMA is based on, but it's modified slightly, and it's more for commercial cloud providers or commercial entities in general that want to sell cloud services to the federal government. So any government customers that want a cloud application or want to be hosted on the cloud, either infrastructure, whatever the case may be, need to have a company that is FedRAMP certified. One of the things that I've heard a lot is that well, actually, I can tell you this from experience also. FedRAMP is by far the toughest of all the compliance programs. The sheer number of requirements can be daunting, and there's just so many hoops you have to jump through in the process in general, not even talking about the controls, just kind of going through the motions of doing the applications, filling out the paperwork, dealing with the government, and so on and so forth. At a minimum, you're probably looking at about 18 months minimum from beginning to end. Just out of curiosity, anyone out here do HIPAA regularly? Okay, so HIPAA and, this light's killing me. HIPAA and FISMA or FedRAMP pretty much have the same set of regulations. They're both based on NIST 853, so they're all, you know, in the same family at least. From what I've seen for large companies in general, not even, it's interesting because not even federal agencies, but more commercial agencies now, whenever they start going to large cloud providers or start migrating their data over, the first thing they ask for is, are you FedRAMP compliant? Or, you know, are you going by these sets of rules? I don't even think they know what it means necessarily. It's become kind of the buzzword, and that's what everybody wants now. So for those that haven't dealt with it before, FedRAMP covers so there's a number of general, I tried to break it down into, you know, 5 easy categories. You have policy management, what needs to be secured and how are we going to secure it from a company's perspective. What plan are we going to put in place? Risk management, remediation and exception management, and we'll tell you a funny story about that later. But how are you going to remediate your findings? How are you going to close some of your risks? And exception management gets a little more difficult with, if we can't successfully mitigate a problem, we're going to have to find a way or build a process to build an exception around that. And one of the things you don't want to do is, if you are going to implement an exception management program, don't advertise it, because then what you're going to find is everybody's going to start asking for exceptions, and nobody's ever going to want to do the thing that you've asked them to do. So it becomes more difficult to manage. Vulnerability management, obviously, how vulnerable are you? What systems are exposed? How do you close them? And, asset and inventory management is another big one. What do I have on my network? And it's crazy, one of the things that I find time and time again is companies don't really know what they have. And so you ask them to take an inventory, or you ask them to draw a diagram of their network, and they can't, because they have no idea what's out there anymore. So it's very difficult to say, is any of this compliant? Is any of this even being monitored? All right, it's acting kind of funny. All right, so oh, that went too far. All right, so anyway, I like to talk about why they started FedRAMP in general. And I have kind of my own personal theory on this, but one of the things that I've seen, working in the federal government space is that, so close, just missed it. All right, we're just going to leave that alone. So one of the things that I've seen working with the federal government is they really have no concept of security in general. They try to go by the books and put everything together, but they just can't quite get it together. And this can be seen if any of you have maybe Googled the annual FISMA reports that come out. It's all public record. And you can see just how bad of shape all the agencies are really in. And so I suspect that at some point, somebody threw up a flag and said, there's no way we can do this. We're spending tons of money. We're just not getting it down right. Years and years keep going by, and we keep failing our own FISMA audits. And so something's got to give. So in 2011, the Office of Management and Budget created the Cloud Adoption Program, and they mandated that all federal agencies be moved over to cloud by June of 2014. So that date's already come and gone, and that's for all low and moderate impact systems. Now, the reality is, even though the date's come and gone, there's a very large number of federal agencies that still haven't migrated completely. It's a very slow process from both ends, both in GSA being able to get all the authorizations and approvals out in time. The process itself is just so long and intense that I just don't think they really timed it right. So, that was 3 months ago was the official FedRAMP date. But they're slowly moving systems along, and they'll get there. So just to kind of go off on a tangent for a second, when we talk about poor government security, let's see if that works. Okay. So one of the things that I like to do is I like to pick on the IRS a little bit. If you Google the IRS FISMA reports, you can actually get them as far back as I think 2008. And so I pulled a little segment from the 2012 FISMA report from the IRS. So the report showed 7,329 vulnerabilities. because 23 critical patches hadn't been installed on the servers, dating as far back as April of 2011. So if this report was done around September of 2012, that's a year and a half that they just hadn't applied these critical patches. The report also stated that, in addition, the IRS has no mechanism to enforce timely patching, obviously, or to hold the system owners accountable. So, I mean, there was clear indication that they weren't able to get it together. And when you think about, all the breaches that are going on, I mean, this is the IRS. I mean, of all the people that need to have their self together, I mean, they really should be it, but. So then we look at 2013 and we say, well, maybe they've improved. So looking at the September 2013 audit, and I'll just read you this verbatim. Until the IRS takes steps to fully implement all 11 security programs covered by FSMA, taxpayer data will remain vulnerable to inappropriate use, modification, or disclosure, possibly without being detected. And that's the IRS. So they had several areas that just weren't effective, including incident response, and their two biggest problem areas were configuration management and access management, very small areas. And this will all be made available later, but you can kind of dig through this. I think the scariest of all for the IRS. Let's see. The IRS has not fully implemented a process to ensure patches. We know that. And then monthly vulnerability scans are still not being performed. So I'm not sure, where their $3 billion a year IT budget's going, but you'd think they'd be able to start running some scans. So, all that together with all the other government agencies, I mean, they're really not that dissimilar from the IRS. And so, when you take all that into consideration, that's, why I think the FedRAMP program was started. I mean, they needed to really offset some of that. So, we talked about it. They can't implement their own security program. And, the accountability, I mean, you saw, I showed you just 2 years of IRS audits where they clearly can't implement a vulnerability management program or a configuration management program. But not only does nobody know about it, but, even when the reports go to Congress, I mean, nobody's doing anything about it. So, I mean, what's the point of even running the audit? And then, I mean, there's the obvious cost savings. I mean, they're going to slash their overhead. They're going to slash their hardware. They're going to slash their support staff. And they're really just offloading everything to the cloud. And that's, they're passing the buck on security. So, FedRAMP. I mean, how secure is FedRAMP? So more people have come in. How many people have experience dealing with 853 in general? Okay. So, like I said earlier, it's a pretty daunting set of security requirements. There's a lot to go through, and I've found that with FedRAMP, it's become a checkbox exercise. I mean, when you're dealing with the government and you're, kind of going through the motions of making sure you have everything filled out, making sure you're dealing with all the requirements, it becomes very apparent very quickly that they're not security people. And so the people who are assigned as your ISSO or, as your security officer contact on their side is really just a standard non-security person who's literally sitting there checking off boxes to make sure you have something done. So the concept of compliance really doesn't go that far with them. All they want to see is that you've marked off what they're expecting you to mark off, and they can move on. So I'm going to show you a couple what I think are significant holes in the 853 process in general. Now, many of these items are fixed with Rev 4. Some of them aren't. But the thing to keep in mind, if you're looking at this from either a fixing it perspective or even a pen testing perspective, companies don't have to recertify with 853 Rev 4 until at least next year. So, I mean, you've got a full year to potentially take advantage of some of this stuff. For the purposes of this presentation, I thought it would be easier to break this up into 3 phases. You have your pre-audit, your audit, and then your continuous monitoring. And that's more or less how it kind of goes down anyway. So one of the, I guess kind of the first step in the process really is to sort of figure out what your system boundary is. And so, you know, you have a number of meetings, and, you know, you have to submit these diagrams, and you kind of jump through all these hoops, and you really go through great lengths to figure out, you know, what the exact system you're certifying is. And for, you know, I mean, for major cloud providers, I mean, you could be talking 500 or 1,000 assets. I mean, the number really can be very large. In the case of Amazon, I can tell you that Amazon actually built their own little mini cloud environment. And so for them, it was, honestly, I think they did a much better job at it. But so they built this small environment. They had a very small footprint, and then they just kind of started growing it as they got clients. So I think that was kind of the smart way to do it, because they bypassed a lot of the hoops here. But so you have to come up with your, you know, what exactly your information system is. And so that's going to include your servers, your virtual machines, all your devices, you know, and so on and so forth. So boundary aside, the other thing, I don't want to spend too much time on the actual controls just because there's so many, but I will say that the Joint Authorization Board and GSA has an unpublished list of 28 absolutely must-have critical controls. And so that's in here if anyone wants it for reference later on, and we'll kind of briefly go through them. But they've, you know, I mean, as you start to go through the process, they kind of feed you the list, and they say, you know, absolutely, these are the first things we're going to be looking at. And so it kind of gives you an idea of, you know, where their head's at in terms of, you know, general security and what they're looking for. All right, so let's talk about defining the boundary. So when you start putting your boundary together, you know, again, this is really the first stage of the process. And it really depends on, well, obviously, I mean, it depends on what product you're wanting to put through the process. Is it, you know, an entire infrastructure? Is it just, you know, something like a Google Apps where you've got just a single product, or, you know, a small array of products? Or are you actually trying to sell virtual clouds? So, you know, possible examples, just to throw a couple out there, I mean, you've got obviously content devices, storage controllers, storage arrays, domain controllers, databases, communication databases, finance. You're always going to find a lot of financial stuff. Obviously, compute pods, and, you know, potentially password repos. You know, it really just kind of depends on what's in there. So it seems, I'll say that this part of the process was one of the longest for me, and I think it's because the company was so disconnected in terms of what they had. I mean, they just didn't know. And, you know, so it's interesting, I'm doing a similar project for a company right now. It's not FedRAMP, but they needed a SOC 2. And so we're starting the interview process, and we're starting to do our gap analysis. And, you know, we're not certifying a cloud. I mean, we're just doing a very small product, and they can't even tell me what infrastructure makes up the product. And so, I mean, at some point, you know, I mean, it would be nice if people kept better records, but they don't. And so I think that's always going to be a major hang-up for people going through this process. So that's, you know, just something to be aware of. So this is the list of critical 28. And obviously, I mean, it's so small on the screen. So I don't want to spend too much time on this just because, you know, there's no need to just read them off the list. I mean, you can get these off the presentation later. I think the important ones, two-factor authentication on everything connecting to the system. And there's absolutely no exception to this. So if you're connecting remotely into the system, or even if you have a local connection to the system, anything that'll get you into the core of the system that you're certifying, you have to have two-factor authentication. And so this is another area that we ended up getting hung up on, but that's another story. System component inventory, another big one. I mean, if you can't even tell yourself what's in the boundary that you're putting together, you definitely don't have an inventory. So putting that together generally takes a little bit of time. And even if you get it together, I mean, how are you going to maintain it? Who's going to maintain it? It's a difficult process. 30-day flaw remediation on high vulnerabilities, 90-day on mediums and lows. And it sucks, but they do make you go after the lows as well. And so a lot of times, operationally, the lows just can't be done. And so it becomes a very long and tedious compliance exercise to kind of go through and explain away why you can't, you know, address these 400 lows. It's just something that they expect. 3 separate backups of all system and user data, all system data and all user data. So you have your, you know, your hot sites, and then you have your off site, your cold site, and your tape storage. Kind of another little side tangent, but does anyone remember a woman by the name of Lois Lerner? She was kind of in the news recently a little bit. So these same regulations are in FISMA. I mean, it's the same set of rules. And, you know, the audits are all public record. So around the time of Lois Lerner's missing emails was, I think it was 2010. And I mean, you can go on Google and just download the 2010 FISMA audit reports and see that all their backup systems had a clean bill of health. So I mean, they kept talking about this one drive that crashed or whatever the case may be. But I mean, the audits clearly show that not only did they have one backup, but they had 3 backups in different locations. So there's a little, obviously, something fishy going on there. So when you're putting together your system boundary, I think one of the most important pieces is system interconnections. And when you're deciding kind of what's going in the boundary, you have to figure out, you know, specifically what's in scope, obviously, versus what they consider to be interconnected. Now, their definition is that a cloud offering needs to be physically and logically separated from their corporate infrastructure. Now, more often than not, this probably isn't going to happen because you have things like AD controllers, RSA, two-factor authentication servers, LDAP authentication servers. Maybe you've got some monitoring systems, financial systems, password vaults. And so you're never going to have completely separate instances of that inside your boundary. And the crazy thing is that they consider this to be, anytime it's a shared system, they consider this to be an interconnected system. And the important takeaway from that is that any interconnected systems are not bound by the same sets of requirements. So if you have, let's say, you have your RSA server. I mean, clearly it plays an important role because people are going to need it to two-factor in. But because it's an interconnected system, you don't have to do the 30-day vulnerability scanning. You don't have to do your 30-day patching. Configuration management's out the window. And so if a company doesn't have to necessarily comply, if there's not a specific reason that a company needs to comply with something, it's not going to. I mean, there's no business justification for it. And so what ends up happening is you have these supercritical systems that are just kind of being left behind. And, you know, it was interesting. I don't know how many of you were here for Kevin and Dave's opening speech a couple days ago, but, you know, Kevin Mitnick had this fantastic example of, you know, he was on a pen test, he was pawning a device, and he was able to get into the admin's, key repository. And so the key repository is such a, I've come to find out, it's such a common thing that, I mean, you can almost expect to find it in large companies. And so when you start talking about that, or that password repository being an interconnected system by the government's definition, it's probably your most secure, or what should be the most secure system, that they're just kind of ignoring. And so somebody who's hip to the regulations can just say, you know what, these are interconnected systems, we don't need to deal with these, we're going to put these outside the boundary, and we don't need to test these on a regular basis. They don't come into play, we don't need to verify them, and they're just out of the picture. And they seem to go along with it.
Quick question.
Sure.
Difference between, like, for example, shared services and Active Directory being considered a shared system, or would it be an interconnected system? Like, for example, with the use of an authentication for everything, let's say, would you have your own domain controller, or would you be able to leverage a shared resource?
I mean, technically, you can do whatever you want. And so it comes down to documenting how you do it. And so if you have a shared domain controller, which I'd say probably 99% of the people will, then you can leverage it as an interconnected system. You know, the definition of an interconnected system is something that's shared with the corporate environment. And that's not to say that it's bad to do that. It's just that's how it needs to be documented. So that's all I really kind of wanted to talk about from a pre-audit perspective. When it comes to, you know, when you finally get your controls in place and when you're finally ready to have the auditors come in and, you know, do everything, it's such an immense task. I think, so I've worked with 2 different sets of auditors before, and let's see, the last time they came out, they were on site for a month, and then they came out for 3 weeks again on top of that. So, I mean, that's just 2 months of just sitting in a conference room with them, just day in and day out. And the data collection portion is so immense. I mean, you get this request list, which is 1,000 items that you now need to go hunt down, which, I mean, you need a team just to do that and keep track of everything. And I mean, I'll give you one piece of advice is, if the company you're working for doesn't want to shell out for software, I mean, try to stay as far away from doing this on a spreadsheet as possible. It becomes the worst thing ever. I would actually recommend, you know, Bugzilla is free, and you can use the ticketing system per request. I mean, you can do a little bit of configuration. I think you gave me a warm one. Have any ice? So,
It makes presentation amazing.
wow. Wow, this is awful. I mean, this is just straight, this is hot. Oh. So you can configure Bugzilla pretty easily. You can use it for tickets. Anytime the auditor has a new request, they can just, you know, they can open up a ticket. You can send it to whoever in the business, or even you can assign it to someone on your own staff to go out and do it, or to go out and collect that item, and then you can track it that way. I will say, this actually isn't too bad. So I will say that this last project that I was on, we had this just completely psychotic woman who decided, so not only did we have to do this on a spreadsheet, but, you know, in working with the auditors, we figured out, you know, there's no critical information on this spreadsheet, so we just kept it on Google Docs. I mean, it was incredibly innocuous. And so we had this nice little flow of collaboration down where we could all go in and we can change, you know, field values to assign it to one another. And then we knew when something was kicked back, we'd have the dates. I mean, we had this whole rhythm going. So it can be done on a spreadsheet. But then at some point, you know, we had started fidgeting with reporting tables at the beginning. And we never finished it because, I mean, nobody ever really thought it was useful. But this woman who was so completely crazy decided that because they weren't working, the spreadsheets themselves in general just, they weren't flowing right. So she got the authorization to take it over. And so any updates that we made, so we had a team of 5. So that was my team, and then we had the auditor's team of 3. And so any updates that we all made would have to go to her, and she would have to take different parts of the spreadsheet and somehow put them together. And literally, she was like copying and pasting out of different spreadsheets. And I mean, she probably added 2 months to our time just in the bottleneck that she created. I mean, it was a mess. So I would definitely advise never, ever doing that. But I mean, if you go, you know, if you go the spreadsheet route, it can be done. I mean, if the company can afford software or is willing to shell out for some sort of GRC software, it would probably be extremely helpful, especially with something this big. Or again, I mean, there's plenty of free bug tracking software that you can use. Yeah, that wasn't so good. So part of the audit is the penetration test. So this is a really interesting penetration test for a few reasons. Number one, there's no discovery scan at all. When they do the test, they're going completely on good faith that you've given them all the information that they need. So, I mean, you could just completely leave out just hundreds of systems they would never know. So that's one problem. They only test external facing systems. So if you have one IP address coming into a web interface that leads into your entire cloud environment, let's say, it's just that web interface that's getting tested in the penetration test. There's absolutely no consideration for internal threats, internal web apps, internal servers, internal devices. None of that is in scope for the pen test. I mean, it's literally an assessment on the front door. That's it. And they do a little bit of physical security testing as part of the controls. You know, they tour the data centers and things like that. They don't do any social engineering that's very specifically laid out. That they, you know, the auditors aren't supposed to go that far, so they don't. So it's external only. I mean, it's crazy. Even if, and this actually blew me away. Even if you have web apps that are part of the boundary, you know, a system that's, you know, specific to whatever it is you're doing, but internal, they still won't be tested because they're inside. So, you know, internal threat is probably overrated anyway. If a device or app is inside the network, then I think the justification is it's already protected because you're inside the boundary and nobody's ever going to get in that front door. And I mean, you know, at the end of the day, I mean, how much damage can one internal web app do anyway? And so, you know, this kills me every time I think about it. So going back to this, you know, this Friday thing with, you know, the opening ceremony with, you know, Kevin and Dave's opening talk. You know, so Kevin was talking about how he was able to get into the corporate password vault. And then he was able to get all the passwords, he got the domain passwords. And I've seen so many companies have just massive vault of passwords. So now, when you think about it from that perspective, I mean, how much damage could somebody do, I don't know, with a 10-year-old custom Java password vault? I mean, probably not a problem, but because it's a shared system, it's interconnected, so you don't really have to test it anyway. So you have a double out on that. So not only do you not have to test your 10-year-old system on the inside, but you really don't have to test it for just general vulnerabilities or anything else around it because it's an interconnection. So I mean, that thing is just completely wide open now. It does grow on you. Get this kind of warm feeling in the morning. So I'll tell you kind of another quick side note. I was talking to a reporter at Politico about this. You know, we were talking about FedRAMP Rev 4 or NIST Rev 4, and we were talking about some of the holes in Rev 3, and I told him this password vault story. And you know, we went into detail about how you'd get to it, you know, what it would do, and then you know, he came back to me and he said, well, you know, we decided that's too specific. Nobody's ever going to have this password vault. It's so specific that the odds of it happening in, you know, another case are just astronomical, and we're not going to write about that. And so when I heard Kevin talk about it, I mean, just the sky opened up for me, and I mean, it was fantastic. So I had to rush back, and I ended up putting it back in, but I was very happy. I don't know why I let him convince me that it probably wasn't, you know, it probably would never happen again, but I'm glad I ended up hearing it again, so that was pretty awesome. So, you know, I mean, if you're able to, passing the audit isn't really that difficult. It really comes down to having the staff. I mean, you probably need about a team of 5 just in evidence collection, depending on, 4 or 5 people, just to go out and gather the evidence, pull everything you need from the business. And the auditors are just going to keep wanting more. And there's always going to be, I'd say 40% of what you collect will be wrong, and you'll have to go back and get it again. And so it becomes a very sort of tedious process. So if you're able to make it through the audit, there's, you know, you go up against the review board, they review the risks, and then eventually you hit your continuous monitoring phase. Now at this point, when you've made it this far, excuse me, you've got to be at least 18 months into the process. That was rough. GSA will tell you that they can probably knock them out in 6 to 9 months, but what they're really saying is, once you do all your stuff and once you do all your paperwork, and when we're really ready to start talking to you and walking through the process, it'll probably take 9 months, but it'll take you another 9 months just to get to that 9 months. And there's absolutely no way you can complete the audit with any high findings. That's vulnerability findings or even findings from the auditor. And they are very, very hell-bent on that. Even if it's, you know, you've got this one custom system with, you know, a fortress around it and nobody's using it, but we need it, I don't know, as a connector to something else, they're not going for it. And they're very, very clear about that from the beginning. Absolutely no highs when you come to the end of the program. And what really, really can burn you is that if the auditors are on site and they're performing their kind of in-person vulnerability scan, and it just so happens that on the day of the scan, a new vulnerability comes out, and now you've got highs on the scan, you've got to wait till the next cycle to show them a clean scan before they'll accept it. They won't even consider that as a way through. I mean, so it has to be completely clean and free, or free and clear. So once you make it through all that, now you have continuous monitoring. Now continuous monitoring, in my opinion, is this just hugely just blown up thing that they've tried to develop for a concept that should be fairly simple. The goal, I think, from their perspective is to somehow get near real-time risk management and really get a good, clean grasp on situational awareness and what's going on with the organization. But yeah, I mean, what they're looking to do, I mean, obviously, you know, you've got the assessment of the controls, you're actively managing risk, and they want you to for lack of a better term. I mean, they want you to understand kind of what threats are in your environment, and they want you to stay on top of it. It really just becomes a matter of just real-time monitoring. You know, how quickly can we detect a breach if it occurs? Can we even detect it before the breach occurs? You know, when they're knocking at the doors. I mean, how much visibility do we have into this? And so the whole continuous monitoring program is all about risk. Now, I don't know how clear this is, but I mean, everything kind of funnels up into risk management. I mean, you have your, it's everything we talked about at the beginning. I mean, you've got your policy management, risk management, remediation and exception management, your document collection, vulnerability management, asset and inventory management. I mean, it's all these different pieces that are funneling up into giving you this sort of one cohesive picture of your environment. So when you hit that phase of continuous monitoring, you do have these the biggest deliverable you're going to have is your monthly vulnerability reporting. So not only do you have to send them a monthly report, but you also need to send them monthly patch reports. So they want to be able to see that everything that you've reported last month got closed, and that everything that you've been reporting in terms of lows and mediums over the last 90 days are also getting closed on time. So you've got to kind of spoon feed all of that to them. And I've since found out that there is not a single vulnerability scanning system that will cleanly print out patch reports. I've tried Nessus, I've tried Retina. Retina, I think, has the most flexibility in terms of what they can report and sort of how you can customize it. But it's really tough to get those reports. And when you ask them kind of how we actually flat out asked them, how were you getting this from other people, or how were you expecting to see it? And they just don't know. So they said, it's really up to you guys to figure it out and show us. So they're no help at all. They have started asking for quarterly configuration compliance reports. So anything in your configuration management scope, they want to see what assets are out of compliance, and if you're correcting them on a quarterly basis. According to the requirements, you technically have to do that much more than quarterly. For some reason, I think the requirement says weekly, that you're supposed to be looking at machines that are out of configuration compliance, but they're only asked for the reports quarterly. Annual contingency planning exercise and test results. They want to make sure you're really testing the system. And the other thing that you're going to be dealing with on a regular basis is your plan of action and milestones document, your POEM, which is essentially it's your project plan on what gaps you have or what risks you have and how you're addressing them and how you're closing them. And so anytime you update that, I mean, it just becomes this constant sort of back and forth. I mean, when you're in this continuous monitoring phase, you pretty much live in that document. Anytime you get new vulnerabilities, you have to update this one spreadsheet. So you have to take all of your vulnerability data and you have to port it into their format, into these just tables that they've created in this spreadsheet. And it's a mess, but then you have to report on them, and it's this whole process. I mean, you need a dedicated person just for that. And depending on how big the environment is, you might actually need two. And then the last thing in terms of deliverables is the incident response or the incident reporting. This is just something that needs to be done on an as-needed basis. If there are incidents, they want to know about it right away. And depending on the severity of the incident is kind of how far up the chain and how quickly up the chain it goes. And that all needs to be kind of detailed ahead of time. Yeah, that's actually it in terms of deliverables. We've got about 10 minutes left. And so I kind of left this open-ended on purpose in case anybody had any questions. I wanted to do more of a Q&A thing. Sure. This one?
Do you have any experience about certifying SaaS solutions?
I'm sorry, one more time?
Do you have any experience in certifying SaaS solutions for FedRAMP?
Yeah, I mean, Yeah, did you have specific questions, or were you kind of going through that process yourself?
So you have to follow this whole process. If you had any experience, you can share any.
Well, I mean, it's honestly, the process is identical. So the short answer is yes. I mean, I do have experience with that, more from a FSMA perspective than actual FedRAMP, but I mean, the process is pretty much the same anyway. I mean, the process is pretty much the same. I mean, the main difference is that your footprint is much smaller. I mean, even though it's SaaS, you're still talking about, you've still got some level of infrastructure, and so that still makes up your boundary. And you may not have all the same, you may not have to worry about a lot of the same things, like you probably won't have I don't know, you're going to need an RSA server, something that connects into the box, where the box is. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it's going to be very similar.
And the infrastructure is based on a large cloud provider that do all the cloud provider controls apply.
Yeah, so that's actually how the government kind of operates in terms of the reason they're asking you or the provider to go out and get FedRAMP is because they still have to put together their FSMA package. And what they're going to do is they're going to leverage all of your FedRAMP controls in their FSMA package. And so the same thing applies, if you've got a SaaS application and you go to a cloud provider that already has FedRAMP and you're on their FedRAMP cloud, well, you've already inherited now everything that they've done. And so your process actually is much, much smaller. So now all you have to do is talk about how you're securing, entry into, your application and things like that. And so it becomes a much easier process.
That's very hard to get animation.
Oh, yep. Yeah, and so we'll publish all of this. They put this stuff online, so I'll have the slides available as well. I think it could be considerably shortened. I think there's a lot of checkbox work, and that kind of stuff drives me crazy. And we kind of mentioned this earlier that you sit there and you try to talk about security concepts to people that just don't understand security, and they don't really want to know how you're doing X, Y, and Z and how that really address. They just want to know that you're doing this to the letter of how you're doing it. And so that kind of stuff really isn't, in my mind, effective. But overall, I think of all the compliance programs, and I say this not having fully gotten into PCI 3, I would say that this is probably by far the most robust. And now, especially with Rev 4 around the corner, I don't think there's anything else that comes close to it. I think Rev 4 addresses a lot of the issues. Specifically, it deals with the interconnected systems. That's a huge one, in my opinion. So with Rev 4, all interconnected systems have to be treated the same. So now you have to do the scanning and the configuration management and everything you had to do to everything else. So they've eliminated that gap completely. But I mean, you've still got a year of time before people are going to get to that.
You're offering some sort of like infrastructure as a service. Who's responsible for doing the patching? Would it be the customer, or would it be you? So, for example, you can just deploy a Windows box. You control the infrastructure. You do whatever you want with the Windows box. Do you do the vulnerability? Is that the company that do the vulnerability and report it to the organization, or do they go in and start patching the systems?
Well, so it depends on how many levels of sort of FedRAMP you have. If you're selling some sort of infrastructure service, it's probably going to be based on a cloud provider that already has FedRAMP. And so, at that level, they are already doing some level of reporting, so you can sort of utilize their controls. But you still have to do, for your portion, you are still going to have to do your set of reporting, whatever that may be. The customers are going to be responsible for patching their Windows boxes and doing some of that smaller stuff, but you're just going to be responsible for the hardware, I guess, associated with the infrastructure. Yeah, exactly. And so that's, yeah, at the very beginning of the process, and I didn't really get into this, but you have these 3 documents that you have to fill out. One's called a CTW, which is a control tailoring workbook, which you talk about, you know, if any of the controls have specific variable requirements, like, you know, you have to do this within at least 7 days. How many days are you going to do this within? Are you going to meet the 7? Are you going to do it in less? Or you have to do it in more? Whatever the case may be. So that you have to fill out kind of that document. Then you have, it's called a CIS, the implementation summary. And this can actually almost be used as a mini gap analysis when you're first starting. It's all the controls listed out. And, you know, you talk about what's implemented, what's not implemented. And so, you know, as you're going down the list, you also have the options of, you know, is this your responsibility, the provider, is it shared responsibility, customers, and so on. And so, you know, if you're really starting this process, I actually really liked this document because it allowed me to get a bird's eye view of everything that was going on. And now the information you get from the business may not necessarily be accurate, but at least you've got sort of this one, you know, quasi-complete thing that you can go by.
So you mentioned continuous monitoring. You're going through this process before you're even having any government customers on your infrastructure?
Not necessarily.
But if you were, what would you be reporting that continuous monitoring to?
So the reporting always goes to GSA. So once you've certified, regardless of whether or not you have customers, you still have to, you get a portal. You get this portal login that you have to kind of log into, and you have to upload your results every month. So you're always going to be doing reporting whether or not you have customers. And actually, your reporting doesn't change when you have customers. It's still the same reporting. Because they're just living on the drives. I mean,
Particular agency, customer, add on their own reporting requirements. For example, non-cloud, but recently one of our customers has transitioned from the, oh, you report your own to we put appliance on your network and we'll continue to monitor your network for you.
yeah, but I guess I don't know the appliance that I don't know the appliance, but I feel like it's a different kind of, you know, when the government says, you know, continuous monitoring, they, you know, really when it boils down to it, they want their reports every month. And so I'm sure that this, you know, I don't know what this appliance does, but, you know, I'm sure it's not taking the scans of the entire environment, or is it?
No, it's an uncertain form.
Oh, okay, I gotcha.
Yeah, so rather than trusting what we provide them, they say, oh, no, that's great, you can continue to provide that, but we're insisting we're installing a scanner on your network,
Oh.
and we'll store you. So I'm just wondering if you've seen anything like that.
I've never seen that before. I mean, I guess, you know, that's a pretty interesting approach, because at that point they're just assuming that you're not going to do your job and they're going to do it for you. I mean, I've never seen it, but I mean, it can certainly be done that way.
Cost savings really there?
I'm sorry?
Is the cost savings really there going to a FedRAMP cloud versus with
I think from a government perspective, I think I mean, when you think about all the manpower they have and all the hardware they have and just trying to keep all that up, I mean, they're spending billions of dollars every year and literally getting nowhere. And so, you know, I can't tell you definitively whether or not, I mean, to me, it seems like a cheaper route to, I mean, they're basically going to be cutting their force down tremendously. And so now all of their, you know, their admins and everything else are really part of the cloud provider. And so they're just offloading all of that. So actually, yeah, from a government perspective, it would be a lot cheaper because I would imagine their force is going to be cut down at least in half. Any other questions? All right, got a couple minutes. Thank you all for coming.